Okay, I'm very happy to have on the Goldstein on Gelt Show, Ely Rosenzveig, who has been a lawyer for 30 years. He specializes in elder law. In fact, he helps clients also with tax issues like dealing with the F-bar. For those of you in Israel, you know that the F-bar is, a nightmare for some, and just an opportunity to tell Uncle Sam about all your assets for others. Ely, real pleasure to have you.
It really is a pleasure, Doug.
So we talk a lot about the financial issues of retirement, but there are a lot of legal pitfalls that people come across when planning for retirement. What's the worst thing you've seen happen that maybe we could tell people not to do today?
It's, I suppose, Doug, that people just don't plan. And part of it, I suppose, is dealing or living in the present, in the moment. Part of it is that in doing retirement planning, you have to deal with the eventuality of death. And as you plan for yourself and for your heirs, and that's an uncomfortable subject that people subconsciously avoid, you have to get over that emotional hurdle and confront the issue constructively, because failing to do so hurts you and also your heirs. I suppose, Doug, another common pitfall is that people do not do advance directives. That's fancy legalese for documents like the financial affairs proxy, what we call in the U.S. a power of attorney, or a proxy for healthcare decision-making, what we call a healthcare proxy. In Israel, of course, the equivalent is a yifui koach. And I've dealt with so many situations over the years where people have failed to make or execute these relatively simple and inexpensive advance directive documents, designating individuals to stand in their stead as their proxies or agents for healthcare and financial decision making. And when that happens, when they don't do this and health issues intervene that render the person unable to make on their own financial or healthcare decisions, and there's no advance directive in place, a guardianship would likely have to be authorized by a court of law, and that's an awfully expensive and emotionally draining experience to go through in the courts.
It certainly sounds very technical. Can you give me a real-life example of maybe you saw where someone didn't plan ahead, and what was the downfall?
The downfall was that a guardianship had to what we call in New York in Article 81, a guardianship had to be prosecuted, had to be forwarded in that person's behalf. And it was contested by an heir, by a child, a daughter in Florida. And because it was contested, you had a mini war in the courtroom. And when all was said and done, we prevailed and got the guardianship in place. But after all was said and done, it cost every bit of $100,000 in legal fees. That's a pretty bad and yet good example of what can happen if you don't do the proper planning.
One of the other areas that we see a lot in terms of financial planning for people is that because women often outlive their husbands, they have special needs in terms of finances. Is it similar in terms of planning on the legal side for women who statistically will live longer than men?
Yeah, and they certainly do. It's the Social Security Administration put out statistics just recently suggesting that a woman who turns 65 today is expected to live to nearly 87, I think 86.6 years, and a man till 84.3. So that's a difference of a little more than 2 years between men and women. A woman does typically outlive a man, as we all know, and what that means as a practical matter from a legal perspective is that a woman must make sure that she has alternatives to her husband on these advance directive instruments that we mentioned. So she needs to have a power of attorney agent or proxy, a healthcare proxy, and a state executor mentioned as an alternative to her husband in these documents, so that in the event that she does outlive her husband, there's someone in place who can help care for her needs. She must also have, and this sounds simple and easy, Doug, but it isn't as a practical matter, and most people don't do it, but should really, and that is a woman should have the right financial advisory and legal professionals in place to help her navigate the morass of issues that may arise when she finds herself bereft of her spouse and must move forward on her own.
We're talking with Ely Rosenzveig, who is a lawyer originally from New York. In fact, he's a member of the New York State Bar. He now lives in Israel. He specializes in elder law and also helps clients with tax issues. He's been talking to us a little bit about some of the important documents that people need, like a power of attorney or a healthcare proxy. And in fact, especially as they might deal or concern women who statistically do live longer than men. I know that as a financial advisor, I do talk to people about the fact that women do have different investment needs, and now we see that they also have different legal needs. Ely, let's turn to a different group of people, which is Americans who are moving to Israel. And in fact, you're a good example of that. Are there different legal concerns that these people have, like do they have to have a different will or have two wills? Are there other worries that they have regarding asset transfer and investing?
I think asset transfer is a big issue. It's an issue that I'm asked quite literally daily. And a person has U.S. assets stateside, and assets in Israel. Assets that are dollar denominated in the States and that are in the shekel here. And they want to transfer or convert dollars to shekels, and they don't want to have to deal with all the amalot and other hotzaot, all the expenses, fees, and charges and conversion percentages that banks charge. How do you navigate that? Well, one thing to do as a practical matter, if the need is not large, nowadays you can actually use a credit card through your bank ATM. We do that at a Bank Leumi ATM in the center of Beit Shemesh, where we live. And you could take this credit card at Chase or Citibank. Both have these features. And you can draw from the ATM a sum from a U.S.-based account, a dollar-denominated account, have it converted into shekels without any fees, charges, or conversion percentages. You get the Shar HaYitzig, the actual up-to-the-minute official conversion rate between the dollar and the shekel, reflected in the transaction without any fees whatsoever. That's for small transactions. If you have larger transactions, supposing you're buying a home or you have to make a down payment on a home or a car, and that's a large transaction, that's for sure. You need to convert $25,000, $100,000, whatever the sum, a larger sum than the $2,500 to $5,000 a day that you can do by credit card at the ATM. In that event, what I recommend, just from my experience, and it's pretty substantial, is that you work through a legitimate Forex transfer agency, and there are many in Israel.
And you feel comfortable with working with them, even though they're not banks?
Correct. Again, the legitimate Forex transfer agencies are just that. They're legitimate, they're credible. They're as credible as banks, in my judgment. And you can transfer or convert dollars, large sums of dollars, to shekels. There is a fee involved, but it is a fraction of what you will incur at any bank. And that certainly is another a very good option for asset transfers.
Okay, let's wrap up by talking about the question of wills, because this is something that comes across my desk a lot. People say, Doug, I have a U.S. brokerage account or IRA account that you deal with, and I also have my home in Israel as well as some accounts here. Do I need to have two wills? What do you answer when people ask you that question?
Yeah, I know this sounds, Doug, like a roundabout answer, but if you'll allow me a moment, I'll just lay the groundwork, because it's not a simple question. A key issue, that bears on the answer to your question of whether one should have a U.S. will and alongside it an Israel will has to do with what types of accounts one has, how their assets are structured both in Israel and abroad. So, for example, and most specifically, joint tenancy rules. As you well know, Doug, we talked about it when I had the privilege of meeting you recently. Joint tenancy rules work very differently here in Israel than in the States. For example, a bank account or a house joint ownership usually works in the U.S. by operation of law as what we call a joint tenancy with right of survivorship, which means that the survivor keeps the account or the house after the other joint holder passes. In Israel, joint tenancy does not work that way. Joint tenancy means that upon death of the one joint holder, the account or house held jointly is divided as follows. The surviving joint holder keeps one half and the children get the other. Now, that may not be the way that the joint holders really want the asset to pass. And in the event that there are assets held jointly in Israel and in the U.S., and you have dollar-denominated assets in the States, shekel-denominated assets here, again, where you're holding assets jointly in both here and abroad. I would recommend that there be a U.S. will and an Israel will, the U.S. will addressing itself to U.S.-based assets and Israel will addressing itself to Israel-based assets, and alongside that, advanced directives as well in both jurisdictions.
Okay, it's certainly, we're just about out of time, so I just want to wrap up and point out the main point of what you said is that determining whether a person is going to need one will or two has a lot to do with his own specific situation, how his accounts are set up, and where the assets are held. We've been talking with Ely Rosenzveig, a lawyer based in Israel, also a member of the New York State Bar Association. Ely, in the last few seconds, just tell us, how can people learn more about your work and follow you?
Well, thank you so much, Doug, for the opportunity to be on your show, and I really appreciate it. My website is www.ejrosenlaw.com, www.ejrosenlaw.com. I can be reached by phone in Beit Shemesh, and I have offices in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv as well. And my Beit Shemesh number is 02-645-7067. And stateside, and I'll be heading stateside this coming Saturday evening, my direct line is 914-816-2901. We have offices in downtown White Plains at 50 Main Street.
Okay, we will put links to that at the show notes of today's show at goldsteinongelt.com. Ely Rosenzveig, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Doug.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.